Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast hosted by Eric Rostad. Join him on his 15-year journey through the immortal books. He'll share what he's learning, explore profound ideas across time and cultures, and share the one thing he always hopes to remember from each immortal book.
Today I'm going to cover the Analects by Confucius. This is book 3 for my 2025 reading list. Well, you've probably heard the statement. Somebody will say something like Confucius say, and then they'll make a statement like "Man who run behind bus get exhausted." And believe it or not, that is not an original statement from Confucius. I know that's hard to believe, but it does tie into something that is known about Confucius, and that is that he makes these short statements that are full of wisdom, kind of these pithy statements that you can take with you. So you've probably heard a lot of those over your life. Chances are most of those were not from Confucius. So what we're going to do today is talk about what is actually in the Analects, the statements by Confucius. So what he writes about is how a person may conduct his or her life. And so what I want to do in this episode is have 3 segments. The first one here will be a little bit about Confucius, and then some of the key terms and ideas that he shares, so that we'll see these across a lot of the different statements. In the second segment, I want to cover 10 themes that show up within the Analects, and then share some of my favorite statements along each of those 10 themes. And then in the final segment, I'll share the one thing, my key takeaway from this work. And it was one that really hit me hard. So I'm looking forward to sharing that. So Confucius the Man, let me read from the preface by An Ping Chin in the Penguin Classics version. I thought this was very interesting. She says this: in the introduction to his translation of Montaigne's essays, Donald Frame tells us Montaigne resists definition, yet this very difficulty points to one answer, that the book is the man. Perhaps the same is true of Confucius in the Analects, but the Analects is not a record of what Confucius wrote, only of what he said. So I'll stop reading the introduction there, but that gives a quick insight. The book is the man. So the Analects are Confucius. And Confucius did not write these, but they were compiled by his disciples after his death. So they are the sayings that he made throughout his life, but it's not like he was the one writing these down. So the Analects, I think of them as selected statements, selected sayings or words of wisdom type of thing. What Confucius says is that he did not originate any of these. He compiled them. He calls himself a transmitter. So in one of the statements, he said, the master said, "I transmit, but do not innovate. I love antiquity and have faith in it." End of quote. So right away we see he is taking wisdom and transmitting it fresh, transmitting it from his mouth. And where he's getting that wisdom is from the ancients. So right away we have this idea that that he's following these ancient paths, that there was something in the past where there was great wisdom in the past. And so he's looking back at that time. It's very similar to what I came across in the Proverbs, where there's also an idea where these are the collected sayings, the collected wisdom of that time. And so, yeah, just first off, let's think of this as a collection, a transmission, as opposed to Confucius writing each of these and coming up with them. That does not take away at all from the wisdom therein. And in fact, it's almost a curation of wisdom from these ancient paths. So that I found that to be very interesting. Just to give a time frame of when Confucius lived, he was roughly a contemporary of Aeschylus in Greece, the first tragedy writer. And they were obviously far apart; they would have never come anywhere near each other. But Confucius lived from 551 BC to 479 BC, and Aeschylus lived 525 to 455. So there would have been a roughly 40 plus year period of overlap in their lives. And so just so we know time frame of when Confucius was living, and this would have been in China. So let me read one other part here of what Confucius considers himself doing. And just as I read these statements, almost all of them start out with "the master said," and then it goes into the saying. So here's this one. This is from Book 9, number 8. "The master said, 'Do I possess an all-knowing cognizance? I do not. If a simple fellow asks me a question, my mind at first is a complete blank, and I have to knock at both sides of the question until everything has been considered and some clarity begins to emerge." End quote. I just love that idea, knocking at both sides of the question. And then also just the admission that at first my mind is completely blank and I have to think through these. I have to think all sides of the question and then respond in that way. So you get the sense that there's a lot of thought, there's a lot of contemplation in these. There's not the quick answer. There's not unnecessary words. There's deep thought behind each of these statements. So now I want to get into more of, I'm calling this observations, but then also there's some of the key terms that come across in the Analects. And so two of those are the gentleman and the rites. So rites could be rituals or rites. And so what Whaley says, and he's one of the translators of the versions that I read, and this is Arthur Whaley. What he says is that the rites and the rituals are the means by which one becomes such a gentleman. And let me read from the introduction just to give a little more insight here. Confucius also expanded the idea of nobility from its hereditary foundation to nobility of behavior. Thus, he used the term chunzu, which originally meant son of a lord, to refer to anyone who behaved according to the way of a gentleman, that is, in a manner appropriate to noble status, regardless of his family origin. Moreover, he argued that names must be used correctly. Even if a person was the son of a lord, he was not a chunzu unless he behaved as such. In this apparently linguistic reform lay the suggestion for a radical restructuring of society. The rites and the attitudes of respect and consideration that ritual fostered were the means by which one became such a gentleman. So I'll end the reading of that section there. And again, that came from Arthur Whaley's introduction. But it was very helpful for me to understand what are we talking about here, because we see the term gentleman come up all over in a very favorable sense of you want to be the gentleman. But how do you become a gentleman, and who is a gentleman? And I love how he just says here, at first the gentleman would have been someone of nobility. And so it would have been by birth. But what he did is he took this from a superiority of birth, and he made it so that Confucius made it so that it was also someone of superiority of morals. And so with morals, that means there would be a path to that way. And so there, throughout, we're seeing gentlemen, but being in the terms of someone who would be in leadership and specifically political leadership. And so I'll get into that a little bit later, but just know at first here, a gentleman is anyone who behaved according to a manner appropriate to noble status, regardless of family origin. And in that, Confucius was changing the definition of that term. So as a gentleman, you were to be a virtuous person. And there was almost this idea of a trickle down, that if the leadership was virtuous, that would trickle down to the entire populace as well. And there's also this idea that a gentleman is already someone of integrity, and they're building upon that. They're building upon their virtues. Let me read another part here, and this comes from the one of the other introductions. Actually, this is one of the Confucius' statements, and this is from Book 1. This is number 14. The master said, "A gentleman does not try to stuff himself when he eats, and is not worried about the comfort of his dwelling. He is anxious about getting things done and careful about what he says. He gravitates towards those who possess moral integrity because he wants to put himself right. One could say that he is someone who loves learning." End quote. So that's a great statement just to kind of give you the idea of what a gentleman is according to Confucius. Here's a few others. So the master said, the gentleman can influence those who are above him. The small man can only influence those who are below him. End quote. So you see there too, there's a contrast in a lot of these statements between the gentleman and the small man, or there'll be other terms kind of for the small man. But the gentleman is, through his life, through his moral integrity, can influence those who are even above him. But that can't be the same with the small man. There's also the strong sense that the gentleman will, the highest goal for that person is to work in the government. And so that gets into one of the things that was surprising to me. I've always considered Confucius a religious teacher, but what the introductions I read here, and then just within the text itself, it's more he was not, well, Confucius was not a religious figure. He sought political influence. So there's a great wisdom about the writings in that sort of thing, and Confucianism is a system of belief. So there's almost like a religion that has grown around it. But Confucius himself was not a religious figure, according to what I read in these books here. And I'll highlight the additions and intros that I read in just a minute. So back to the gentleman and the rites. So rites, R-I-T-E-S, also referred to as rituals. That is how the gentleman is to be, that the rites and rituals are the means by which one is to become a gentleman. So with the rites, there were 300 major rites and then 3,000 minor ones. And these were the means of inculcating values and teaching people to behave in a socially beneficial manner. That's how Whaley describes it. I was talking to Dr. Jason Staples about Confucius, and he teaches this at the university level. And he says at the beginning of class, he does something to show students what rites are or what rituals are. And he says, I'm going to show you a magic trick. And he has one student come up, and he puts his hand out, and that student inevitably shakes his hand, and then he says, you may sit down. You've shown my magic trick. And he shows that just this handshake, it's one of our rituals, one of our many rituals. We don't even know they're there. I mean, it's just kind of unconscious. We just walk up to people, we shake their hands. That's one of our rituals. But it governs so much of what we do, how we behave. And so there's cultural aspects of them, but they're almost magic tricks in the way that they can cause you to take an action, and you don't even realize you're doing it, as in the case of the handshake. So let me read a few quotes about rites, and these are from the introductions of these books. So the former kings were concerned about the frequent occurrences of conflict in the world, and so established the rites in order to foster a sense of respect in their subjects, end quote. So with this, it's almost like laws in that sense of just, there's a certain type of behavior we want. Let's put these rites in place that keep those going. And then another statement, rites are meant to help a person find balance in the tug between the call for refinement and his natural proclivities. There's another part that says literature is the vehicle for transmitting the Tao, and the Tao is the way. And again, the way is kind of the way of moral integrity. And so the literature in these ancient paths, that was the vehicle for transmitting the Tao. The rites were the means to make it evident. So that just kind of also helps just us know the difference between how literature and these rites and rituals were viewed as well. The way that it's been helpful for me to think about them is the rites and rituals are kind of the behaviors that help you take something from the conscious to the unconscious. So even in that example of the handshake, at some point in your life, you were probably taught, or you saw people shaking hands. You're like, okay, that's just what people do. Now to where you don't even think about it. You just put out your hand, and so just kind of these rituals, these actions that take things from a conscious level to an unconscious, where we just naturally do them. In terms of what Confucius, the type of literature. This is different from other wisdom literature that I've read, things like the Proverbs, in that many of these statements are directed toward a specific person and a specific situation. So I want to read an example, and this is what is known as the silver rule. So not the golden rule, but the silver rule. And this one comes from book 15, number 23. Su Kong asked, saying, "Is there any single saying that one can act upon all day and every day?" The master said, "Perhaps the saying about consideration. Never do to others what you would not like them to do to you." End quote. So we see a few things going on here. First, Su Kong asked, saying, so we've got an actual person who is asking Confucius, who is referred to as the master, and then we have Confucius's response. And then in this one, it's a very famous response with, it's kind of a reverse golden rule, or some people call it the silver rule. And it's put more at the restraint level as opposed to the positive action level of the golden rule. So do not do to others never do to others what you would not want them to do to you. Whereas the golden rule is do unto others as you would have them do to you, more on the positive action side of it. The way that another translator puts it is, do not impose on others what you do not desire for yourself. So, but what's interesting is, so Su Kong is the person there, and you start seeing these names over and over. And so some of these people are disciples of Confucius. Some of them are the leaders of the different areas, and you start seeing their names over and over. And so it's very interesting in that sense, just that these are it makes it localized. Like Confucius, you get the sense he's just going around, he's talking to specific people. It's not like he just released these statements out to the wind. It's like they were for specific people in specific situations. And what it does is it makes you think of people that are like these people. And what I found very helpful in the different translations I read is just to have notes that told about these people. And in fact, if I were to reread this book, I would make a list of each of the people in the back of the book and then just write what I learn about them every time their name comes up. And in that sense, it's almost like a novel, because that's what I do when I read a novel. I take one of the pages of the back of the book, I write all the characters' names down and then key things about them. So if I forget who they are later on in the novel, I can go back to that page. I wish I had done that in the reading of this, but just know that going in that it's a very personalized thing. And I found that to be very, very neat. Last thing I want to highlight here in the observations side of thing is just this idea of in the beginning. So in Whaley's introduction, he says this: the past in the Analects, as in other texts of the period, began not with a creation myth, but with an era of perfect rulers. So, end quote there. So Confucius is looking back at this earlier time, and it's a time that has been lost. And so the rulers of his day have lost the way. They've lost the Tao. But the way of heaven is a moral one, and it's the way of the ancients. So there's this strong push the entire time of like, let's look back to these ancient rulers, these perfect rulers, this era of perfect rulers. And that is what we're trying to get back to. So you see that over and over, and just this mention of the ancients and in these ancient rulers. There are, 7 works in the Confucian canon. So the Analects, the one that I'm covering today, that's one of them. Another one is called the Book of Songs, and I purchased this one. There's a translation by Arthur Whaley, who did one of the translations of the Analects that I read. And so that's the second book of the canon. The third one is the Book of History. The fourth, the Record of the Rites. The fifth, the Spring and Autumn Annuals. The sixth, the Book of Changes, and then the seventh is the Book of Music, and that one is lost. I believe the other 6 are still have survived. And so if you're wanting to know all about Confucius, those would be the 7 books you would want to read. The Analects is his most famous one here. I read 2 different versions of this. I just planned to read one, but I got into it and I really enjoyed it. And so As with other books in this project, I love seeing different translations. I love seeing how different words are translated. And I really got stuck on the gentleman and the rites thing and just wanted to see what else someone said about those things. And so I started off with the Arthur Waley translation. And this is the one you get if you get the Everyman's Library version of the book, which, by the way, I think Everyman's Library, the hardcover, are... to me, it's the perfect book, like the size, the feel, everything. I just love them. And so I was very happy to start with that one. Arthur Waley did this translation in 1938. So it is, it's under 100 years old, but getting close to that point. The other translation I picked up was the Penguin Classics, and this one's done by An Ping Chin. And this was done in 2014, so this is a lot more recent. And let me just talk about the structure of each of these books. So the Arthur Waley one, there is a great introduction, and then there is a great preface where he goes through the definitions of the main terms that you're going to find in the Analects. And so he gives you the what it is in Chinese and then the English translation, but then really describes what that is. So I actually started directly with the Analects, and then I went back and read the introduction. But if you were to get this book, it's just a great intro on what you're about to encounter, and then just a good idea of some of those main terms. Then when you get to the books of the Analects, and there are 20 of them, it's just the Analects. There are a few footnotes that he has, but you're just in the Analects. There are additional notes in the back of the book that give further insight. So when you're in the Analects, it's just the Analects. That contrasts with the An Ping Chin version, which has a great preface and then a great introduction, and then you get into the 20 books of the Analects. But where she differs is that she puts the notes right with the statements. And the notes are oftentimes probably 5-6 times as long as the actual statements. And she is telling you about the person mentioned. She's telling you about the term that is used. So I found this to be very helpful because you're getting the context right with the Analects. So if you plan to read it twice, you may want to do the same way I did, where you do the Arthur Waley translation first, where you just read through the Analects and just, without any notes or that kind of thing. And then the second time to use this An Ping Chin version, where there are just great notes, and she's looking at all the scholarship that has happened since Confucius and how people have viewed what he said. And she'll give you kind of both sides of the coin, different ways to interpret what the statement is, because some of the statements are, they're such that you need more context to understand them, or it's just helpful to know the life of the person that he's referring to. And so the specific statement that he gives, it has so much more meaning when you know a little more about that person. So for reading stats, each one of these took me around 7.5 hours to read, but that is including the Analects, that's including the intro, the notes, that kind of thing. You could probably get through, if you just read the Analects, you could probably get through them in 1 or 2 long readings. And it's also one of those where there are some of the books that have somewhat of a theme, but in general, it's just more, it's more kind of like picking up the book of Proverbs, especially like in the middle of the book, where it's just wisdom sayings, and you could just kind of pick it up at any time and open up and start reading, and not have to start like at the beginning or at a certain point. So you're looking at around 7.5 hours if you want to read everything in the book. You're looking at probably a couple hours if you just read the Analects. So next segment here, I'm going to get into 10 themes and then some of the statements I liked the most along each of those themes. All right, here are the 10 themes, and then I will share some statements for each of these. Rectifying names or correcting language, that's the first one. Being humane, perception versus reality, worrying about yourself, actions and words, love of antiquity, love of learning, shutting up, honoring your parents, upright versus crooked, and military action. So let's start with rectifying names, also referred to as the correct language. So there's a there's one of the statements, and I'll read it in total here. This is from the Anping Chin translation. And so here we go. Zilu asked, if the ruler of Wei were to wait for you to take charge of his government, what would you do first? And the master said, it would have to be rectifying names. And I'll end the quote there. In the introduction, this is what Anping Chin says about rectifying names. His views on the principles of government appears in 13.3, where he says that rectifying names is what he would attend to first if he were to take charge of a government. Because if names are not rectified, what is said will not seem reasonable. When what is said does not seem reasonable, nothing will get accomplished. What this means is that if a government does not restore the integrity of names and words before everything else, then no one will trust what is being said, and consequently, nothing can get done. End quote. I found this to be so interesting. And as a first order of government, I mean, what would you do if you were appointed leader? Would you right wrongs? Would you enact laws? Like, what would be the first thing that you would do? And Confucius says the first thing you should do is to rectify names. The way that Arthur Waley translates that is to correct language. And so there's this idea, if terms are being used, if phrases, if words are being used in an incorrect manner, the very first thing the new leader, the new government needs to do is to correct that language. Just thought that was a very interesting point. Next item of the 10, being humane. This comes up a lot, just being a humane person. And so this is what is meant by this, and this comes from a note in the Anping Chin translation. A humane man is someone who is able to feel the fear and anxiety of another more sharply than other people, and also someone who will always act on his empathy. End quote. So that was helpful. Again, a lot of this is just, you're going to see these terms come up a lot. What does Confucius mean by them? So that's part of what I'm sharing here, is just how these terms are used so that it helps during the reading. The third one here, perception versus reality. Here's one. The master said, do not worry that you have no official position. Worry about not having the qualifications to deserve a position. Do not worry that others do not know you. Seek to be worthy of being known. End quote. And that's just one of many. And that's kind of the point here. These themes, you see so many different statements that are along these lines. Sometimes there are repeats of the exact same quote from one book to another along these lines as well. But you see a lot along those lines of perception versus reality. And it's always, do not worry about what other people are thinking about you. You need to worry about yourself. And that ties very closely with the fourth thing, worry about yourself. In this is the Arthur Waley translation. He says, the master said, the good man does not grieve what other people do not recognize his merits. His only anxiety is lest he should fail to recognize theirs. End quote. Another one, the master said, a gentleman is distressed by his own lack of capacity. He is never distressed at the failure of others to recognize his merits. End quote. And the final one on this line, be hard on yourself and be sparing when criticizing others. Some great advice, but again, don't worry and don't call out things about other people. Don't call out failures of other people. Always look to yourself first and be distressed at your own lack of capacity. The fourth item, actions and words. There is this strong sense throughout that you should be slow in word and prompt in deed. So speak very little is one of the main points of Confucius. So here are some of the statements along those lines. The master said, people in ancient times did not speak carelessly, for they knew to feel ashamed if their action did not measure up to their words. Another one, the gentleman tends to be hesitant about speaking, but quick to act. Did I pass on any knowledge I myself had not put into practice? That's a statement, and I love that one. It's this idea that if you are to speak something, you should be living it. You should have put it into practice, and you should only speak after you have actually practiced the thing. You should not say it beforehand. Here's another one. If the ruler himself is upright, all will go well, even though he does not give orders. But if he himself is not upright, even though he gives orders, they will not be obeyed. So again, just this actions versus words, but actions need to precede the words. Be very reluctant to speak. I'm trying to take that into consideration in all of my dealings with people, just to be very slow to speak, and it is quite hard. The fifth one, love of antiquity. The master said, I was not born with knowledge, but I love antiquity and I work hard in pursuing it. I just am personally a fan of this idea of following the ancient paths and loving antiquity. So I really enjoyed all of these statements of Confucius about antiquity. So here's another one. I love antiquity and have faith in it. End quote. And then another one here. Su Chang asked about the way of the good people. The master said, he who does not tread in the tracks cannot expect to find his way into the inner room. So again, he who does not tread in the tracks. So he who does not go in the way. And that's the end of that quote. Sixth one here, the love of learning. And the love of learning, the idea here is that you are copying the ancients. So very closely tied with the last one I shared. The master said, learn as if you will never catch up, as though you were afraid of losing whatever you have already understood. End quote. So that should be your attitude of learning. Learn as if you will never catch up. Another one, the master said, a person is worthy of being a teacher if he is able to gain new insights from chewing over what he already knew. End quote. I love that. Just, it's not always seeking out these new ideas or these new things, but chewing on what you already know and gaining insights from those things. There's also the strong sense that for Confucius himself, learning gave him intense pleasure. And so I loved seeing those statements dealing with that. Here's a final one regarding the love of learning. Su Xia said, he who from day to day is conscious of what he still lacks and from month to month never forgets what he has already learnt, may indeed be called a true lover of learning. End quote. So let me just highlight again. He who is conscious of what he still lacks, so what he doesn't know, and from month to month never forgets what he has already learned, he may be called a true lover of learning. So those are two obviously very difficult things to accomplish. One, to just know what you lack. We like to think that we are much more knowledgeable than we actually are. I've actually found reading to be a helpful counter to that, just because you're constantly confronted with references and things that you have no idea about. And so you just kind of are continually reminded that you know so little. But then from month to month to never forget what you already learned, I find this to be very difficult. And it's something I'm working on, just to try to better remember what I read. And my one thing for the Analects will actually tie in very closely with that. But yeah, just that's what is a true lover of learning, according to Confucius. We've got four more here. So number 7 is shutting up. So the master said, he who holds no rank in a state does not discuss its policies. End quote. Boy, that would kill Twitter, wouldn't it? If you do not have any rank in the government, if you do not have a position in an organization, you do not discuss its policies. Man, that would cut down so much of what people talk about. Number 8, honoring your parents. There's this idea that when your parents die, you are to take a 3-year period of mourning. And the idea is that your parents gave you 3 years of intense care when you were first born, where you could not take care of yourself. And so you need that period upon their death to properly mourn them. And that would be a time for reflection. And as Ann Ping Chin says, it's reflection and then entering the next stage of your life. Number 9, the upright versus the crooked. And here's one: raise the upright and place them above the crooked. This will cause the crooked to be upright. And the way that Arthur Waley translates that is it makes the crooked straight. So again, just this idea of you want to raise the upright into places of authority. And if you do that, it will cause the crooked to be upright. It will make the crooked straight. If you do it the other way around, you're in a whole world of trouble. The last item, military action. The master said, a good man will give his people 7 years of instruction before he is ready to arm them for military action. End quote. And man, you think about that, like basic training and all that. You imagine that being 7 years. What if it was required that someone had to go through 7 years of instruction before they were ready for military action? And the idea in this is that it would have been a combination of moral education as well as military training, but that you would have had to do that for 7 years. If you were to be a good man or a good leader, you would want that in your military for there to be 7 years. Well, those are the 10 themes that I saw over and over that really stuck out to me and some of the sayings. Now, next segment, I'll get into the one thing, my one thing I'm still thinking about the most after reading the Analects. All right, now onto the one thing. I am so excited about this one. It has really made an impact, and it's one of those that I know I'm going to be thinking about this a lot going forward. And so let me read the specific saying that sparked this. The master said, "Zigong, do you think I am the sort of person who learns many things and who retains his knowledge in his mind?" Zigong replied, "Yes. Is it not so?" Confucius replies, "No, I bind it together into a single thread," end quote. So let me unpack that a little bit here. So Confucius is saying and is asking Zigong, I believe one of his disciples, "Do you think I am the sort of person who learns many things and then just retains this knowledge in my mind?" And his disciple says, "Yes. Isn't this the case?" And Confucius says, "No, I bind it together in a single thread." Now, there's another reference to this single thread, and that comes in, so the one I just read is from book 15, number 3. There's another one in book 4, number 15, and this one says, "The master said, 'Shen, my way has one thread that runs right through it.' Master Seng said, 'Yes.' When the master had gone out, the disciples asked, saying, 'What did he mean?' Master Seng said, 'Our master's way is simply this: loyalty, consideration.'" End quote. And then there is there's a note in the Arthur Waley translation at the bottom. It says, "Loyalty to superiors, consideration for the feelings of others, not doing to them anything one would not like to have done to oneself, as defined below." So what Confucius is saying here is that I bind them all together into a single thread, and that single thread ends up being the silver rule that I referred to earlier. And so that is the single thread that goes through all of Confucius's sayings. And what he tells his disciple here is, I do not remember everything that I have learned. But the way that I retain is to bind it together into a single thread. That was so helpful to me because a big component of this reading project is I'm trying to find the best ways to remember what I read. And it is really hard. I mean, I will read a book and I do all these things to try to remember it. And then I look at the book on my shelf and I think, do I remember? Like, what was that about? What were some of the key things in that book? And so I have all these different practices in place where I try to make that something where I can remember. And in this segment itself, the one thing is one of the main things I try to do to help me remember what I read. But this takes it a step further. And instead of just like the one thing from each book, it's what if I tried to do that? What if I tried to pull a single thread through all of these books? I do something similar in the sense that I've noticed important ideas that have spanned all sorts of different books from different genres, authors, time periods, and all that. And I call those my important ideas. And those are things like means versus ends, Ares versus Areopagus, so kind of this deliberation versus force, the importance of time. And so I kind of clump different books together along these important ideas. But could I go further? Is there like one single idea, kind of like the silver rule for Confucius, that would pull together every book that would, in turn, would help me to remember all of the books? And because I would remember what that book said about that single thread and how it related to that single thread. Maybe there isn't just one single idea, but I love that idea. And I think it's something that would be different for everyone, just based on what they're reading. And I think it'd be a fun thing to pursue. So if you do have one, if there's kind of a single thread that you have seen in all of what you have read, I would love to know about that. So please put that in the comments for this episode. But in the meantime, I'm going to consider pursuing the important ideas, but then see if perhaps there is a way where that kind of goes into one single thread. And it might be a way that can better help me to remember what I read. I just found that so fascinating. No, I bind it together into a single thread. Well, in conclusion here, this is the type of book that I see myself kind of pulling from the shelf every now and then and just flipping through it. It's not one I necessarily need to take down and read the entire thing cover to cover, but it's one where it's just, maybe I have a few minutes, I can just kind of take it off the shelf and read some of these statements and just ponder them. I really liked this book. I didn't know what to expect going into it. I actually thought it was going to be more of a religious text. It does have the connotation more of wisdom literature though, but personalized wisdom literature, in that Confucius is speaking to specific people, and these are his collected sayings, but it was not to like a group of people he was teaching, but most of the time it's something he said to an individual in a given circumstance. And so just the more you read, the more you learn about the individuals, the more you learn about what was meant with these words, and kind of maybe the difficult concept in that we might have one word or multiple words for the concept, but to try to get into the mind of what was being meant by Confucius at that time. I do hope you pick it up. I'd suggest one of those translations that I read, that I highlighted earlier, and I think you'll really enjoy them and get a lot out of them. It's just kind of fun too to think of Chinese history and how this played a role, and then just to kind of view it through that prism. So I look forward to that as well, just as I read more works from China, as I read more about Chinese history, just kind of seeing the influence of the Analects on the history of China. That's going to do it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. I would love to hear from you, especially if you've read the Analects. Please comment in Substack on this podcast episode. That will allow other people to see your comments, and then to reply and just to get a conversation going, which is one of my deepest hopes for this reading project. Just that you kind of gather a group of lovers of literature, and we can talk about these books together. You can follow Books of Titans on Instagram or Twitter. I also have a website at books.booksoftitans.com that has all of my reading lists from 2017 to now. It also has my Immortal Books reading list, which the Analects is part of that. I believe it's number 10 out of 200 on the list. And so, what I plan to do next is Anping Chin has a book about Confucius, and my plan is to read that next and then cover that in next week's episode. So whereas this episode highlighted more the Analects, I really want to learn more about Confucius. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to hope to finish that in this next week and then share with you guys what I learned about Confucius. So until then, keep reading, keep learning, and keep listening. I'm out.